Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Dan Giannini, and I'm a graduate student at Harvard University. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon for the next talk in the Innovators in Cognitive Neuroscience speaker series. Before beginning today, we want to acknowledge the Indigenous land from which we are joining today's talk. I'm speaking to you from Massachusetts, a state named for the Massachusetts people from whom this land was taken. And I'm posting, Lauren just posted a link in the chat that you can use to research and reflect on the Indigenous lands from which you're joining us. We believe that through the acknowledgement of past harms, we can step forwards toward more equitable and humane futures. So on behalf of all the students and postdocs on the organizing committee, I'm excited to welcome you all today to the Innovators in Cognitive Neuroscience seminar. The organizing committee together represents a consortium of colleges and universities, including Dartmouth, Gallaudet, University of Pennsylvania, Yale, MIT, Princeton, Harvard, and Columbia. We acknowledge the privilege of these institutions, and we wish to make the science discussed here available and accessible beyond the ivory tower of academia. So with the consent of our speakers, we plan to make these talks available publicly on our website and open to anyone who's interested. So that brings us to today's speaker, who Lauren will introduce.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lauren DiNicola, and I am excited to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Fedorenko. Dr. Fedorenko received a bachelor's degree from Harvard and then a PhD in cognitive science from MIT. She then joined the faculty at MGH and Harvard Medical School before returning to MIT in 2019, where she is now the Frederick A. and Carol J. Middleton Career Development Associate Professor of Neuroscience in the BCS Department and the McGovern Institute for Brain Research. Dr. Fedorenko's work examines how our brains support our production and understanding of language, a hallmark of human cognition. And her research grapples with so many questions, from the role of language in thought to changes in the language system across development or with brain damage, to the relationship between language and other cognitive abilities. Her discoveries have included functional specialization for language processing brain regions and associations between language and nearby networks. And although I find Dr. Fedorenko's work, including her within individual approach, inspiring, even beyond academic achievements and accolades, beyond her multiple grants and awards, Dr. Fedorenko inspires me by her commitment to improving science, to making our work more open, our mentorship more transparent, and our field more inclusive and creative. And I'm excited to continue learning from Dr. Fedorenko today, as she tells us more about the language system in the human brain. And as one final note to anyone new to this series, after the talk is over, we will move to a new Zoom room for a more informal Q&A. This is a space for trainees in particular to ask additional questions, either related to or beyond the talk. So I'll post the link in the chat for that now, and then once more at the end. And with that, I'm honored to welcome our speaker, Dr. Fedorenko.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Let me just make sure the right screen is shared. Thank you very much for this kind intro. Can you guys see the slides okay? Yeah, great.
Yes.
All right. It's a real pleasure to share with you some of the stuff that we've learned about how language works in the brain in the last decade or so. In this version of the talk, I put together a few months ago in some form or other. And in this version, I'm kind of thinking through some of the things we've learned about language through the lens of the question of why we have language as a species. So I'll start with a quote from one of my favorite scientists, David Marr, who wrote that to understand the relationship between behavior and brain, one has to begin by defining the function or computational goal of a complete behavior. Only then can a neuroscientist determine how the brain achieves that goal. Now, language, which can be broadly defined as a generative system of form-meaning mappings with some additional constraints, emerged in our species a while ago, and there's some debate as to when exactly. But regardless of when it emerged, we can try to ask, why did it emerge? And for many components of living organisms, the function is obvious and clear, like we have lungs to breathe, hands to grasp, legs to walk, and so on. For language, it may seem clear, but it's been fiercely debated for centuries. In particular, there have been two ideas that have been prominent. One, perhaps the more intuitive one, is that we have language to share thoughts with each other. And we can speculate on why that might be useful, with hypotheses ranging from facilitation of cooperative behaviors like hunting or defense, to passing on knowledge about technical things like how to make tools, or socially relevant information like who to trust. An alternative idea, however, is that language evolved to enable us to think more complex thoughts. And in fact, one of the most famous philosophers of language, Noam Chomsky, has been arguing for many years against the communicative function of language, saying things like, so this is just from a couple of years ago, but he's been very consistently making this claim for many years. And he says things like, almost all of your use of language is internal. Virtually all of the use of language has nothing to do with communication. The idea that language has evolved as a system of communication or designed for communication makes no sense. Instead, Chomsky has long argued that language evolved in order to enable more complex thought. So he writes, the systems of thought use linguistic expressions for reasoning, interpretation, organizing action, and other mental acts. And this idea has been advocated by many others, including famously in early work by Wittgenstein, who said the limit of my language mean the limits of my world. And all the philosophizing is good and well, but ideally, we as scientists would like to have some empirical evidence to bear on this question. And evolutionary questions are difficult, but I'm going to argue that there is some kinds of data that can inform this question, albeit perhaps indirectly. So first, we can examine the relationship between language and other aspects of cognition, including, on the one hand, complex thought and reasoning, and on the other hand, social cognitive abilities, to see if language may be in some way closer to one or the other. And I'll clarify what I mean by closer. And second, we can examine different properties of language to see if they may shed light on what the language system may be useful for. So before I do this, let me introduce you to the system I'll be talking about, what I'll casually often refer to as the language network. So we've long known that there's a set of regions in our brain, more prominent in the left hemisphere in most individuals, that are somehow important for language. Using brain imaging tools like functional MRI, we can find these regions in just a few minutes of scanning by contrasting responses to when individuals read or listen to sentences compared to stimuli that are perceptually similar but lack meaning and structure. So you can compare sentences to sequences of non-words, or speech in the language you understand compared to speech in some foreign language where the acoustics are there, but you can't interpret the signal. And any similar contrast will give you these same regions. And these brain areas exhibit a few important properties. So they respond robustly during comprehension, regardless of whether the information is coming in through your eyes, if you're reading or watching somebody sign, or if you're listening to speech. So at the point the system receives at this point the system comes online, the inputs have converged, so the system is amodal in that sense. The system also responds robustly during language production, again, regardless of whether you're speaking utterances or writing or typing them. And together, these two properties strongly suggest that the system stores our linguistic knowledge representations, which of course can be used to both interpret incoming signals and generate outgoing utterances. These regions are topographically and functionally similar across typologically diverse languages. So this work is still in the early stages, but we have now tested in kind of coarse ways for now, some basic properties of the system in over 50 languages across more than 10 language families, and found that not just the basic topography is similar, but some of the functional signatures, like the ones I'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation, appear to hold across speakers of these diverse languages. And this work, like I said, it's at the early stages, but I think it's super, super important because the vast bulk of language work in cognitive neuroscience has been done on English and a little bit on some other languages, mostly Germanic. Dutch and German are commonly used. And it's not just that it would be nice to be inclusive and more representative of the on the order of 6,000 languages that are spoken across the world, but I think there also have been potential biases that have been introduced in how we think about language due to the unusual properties of the languages that happen to have been studied. So for example, English is very unusual in that the word order is very strict. In most languages, this is not the case. In the vast majority of languages of the world, it's not the case. And I think this has led to an undue emphasis on sequencing as a key feature of human language. But I'll leave it at that for now. We can talk about it more in the discussion. Another important property of the system is that the different regions are strongly correlated in their activity, suggesting that they form a functionally integrated system where these regions work together in the service of a common goal. At least for some parts of this network, if they are damaged during adult years, we end up with problems with language comprehension, production, or both. If this cortex that corresponds to the language system in adulthood is damaged early on in childhood, that doesn't seem to have much of an effect. You can have a perfectly functional language system in your right hemisphere, for example, but in adulthood, this damage to the system leads to aphasia, linguistic deficits. I already mentioned to you that you can find this network with functional contrasts like sentences versus sequences of non-words or speech versus backward speech. But this network is also one of the kind of intrinsic networks in the brain. So if you put people in the scanner and just have them do nothing for a few minutes, a paradigm known as resting state, you can recover this network from just patterns of bold signal fluctuation. So how time courses of voxels go up and down together. And this is recent evidence from Rod Braga's work showing, so I'm here showing you 3 sample subjects and zooming in on one of them here. And there's 2 kinds of data shown here. So in black outlines are the outlines of the network as defined from intrinsic bold signal fluctuations. So this is just the network that's there co-fluctuating together, the set of voxels that co-fluctuates together. And overlaid in yellow and orange are activations for the sentences over non-words contrast. So the contrast that my group has been using for the last 10 years to find these regions. And there's an amazingly tight correspondence. And to me, this suggests that a contrast like, say, sentences versus non-words or speech versus backward speech is just a quick and dirty way to pull the system out, pull this network out of the brain so it can be examined for whatever critical hypothesis we want to test. But the system is a meaningful, coherent, and stable functional subset of the brain that's worthy of investigation, a natural kind, if you wish. Another important point about this network is that the precise locations of these areas vary substantially across individuals. You can see it in just these 3 participants shown here, but we've also quantified this across vast numbers of individuals. So the general topography is very replicable, but where exactly these regions are varies quite a bit. And this variability that characterizes networks that land in frontal, temporal, and parietal cortex has
sorry to interrupt. Can we pin the interpreter, please? Folks are saying they're not able to see the interpreter.
They're pinned.
And Dr. Fedorenko, if you could slow down a little bit, that would be wonderful.
Okay, I'll try. Okay, and so because of this variability that's long known, I have argued that identifying these regions at the individual level is critical for drawing meaningful inferences. Because it's not always, I've argued for this mostly in functional MRI, but this general logic applies to other modalities like MAG and intracranial recordings. But because it's may not always be possible to identify these regions in individuals, we've also developed and are getting ready to release a probabilistic language atlas based on over 800 people we've scanned on these language paradigms over the last bunch of years, where for any given point in the MNI space or the FS average space, you can now estimate the probability that that point belongs to the language system. And this way you can interpret peaks from past group level studies or lesion locations or other things. Okay, so now on to the first kind of evidence that's relevant to the relationship between the language system and the rest of our mind and brain. So let me start by just considering the space of abilities that humans are endowed with. Many of these are shared with non-human primates and other mammals. Some of them are specific to humans. So we of course have a rich set of perceptual abilities, which allow us to recognize objects, faces, or voices. We have motor intelligence, which supports our ability to physically interact with the world. We can do things like solve math problems, engage in logical reasoning, although things like math are not culturally universal. There's cultures where exact math is not part of the cognitive repertoire. We can acquire totally new evolutionary skills, which are certainly not culturally universal. We can do things like talk to computers through computer code. We can create and appreciate music. We have a host of executive abilities, executive control abilities like attention, working memory, ability to inhibit irrelevant information, as well as planning, including long-term planning and decision-making. And using these kinds of abilities, we can solve new problems, including on totally new, abstract, unfamiliar stimuli. We can interact cooperatively with conspecifics and jointly solve problems. We can figure out what somebody else is thinking or feeling and resolve conflicts, both locally and at a global scale, societal scale. And of course, we have a rich knowledge of the world, of how the world works, of different objects and their various properties, of the kinds of events that can happen, of the physical constraints in the world, like how gravity works and things like that, and of things that are possible in real life as opposed to only in our imagination. So what is the relationship between our language system and all of these other abilities? Over the years, people have argued for overlap between language processing and almost any aspect of cognition and even perception and motor control that you can think of. But I'm going to argue that language doesn't share resources with any of these abilities. But that in spite of this sharp separation between language machinery and other kinds of cognitive machinery, I would argue that there's an intimate link between the system that supports language processing and social cognition. So to probe the relationship between any two abilities, two methods are primarily used. One is functional MRI, and the other one is investigations of patients with brain damage. So first, I'm going to present to you some fMRI evidence. This is now pooling data from across a number of experiments that we've done over the last several years, where we looked for overlap between language and diverse other kinds of tasks, perceptual, cognitive, and motor tasks. And to do this, we basically found language responsive areas in each individual brain and then asked, do these same regions that work really hard when we process language, are they active when we listen to music or do math or engage in social interaction that does involve linguistic exchanges? And so first I'll show you in dark gray our responses to our localizer condition. So this is processing language, listening or reading sentences. And then light gray is a response to sequences of non-words like blikit or florp. And these are, of course, estimated using independent data, using cross-validation across subsets of the data. And in different colors, I'll show you responses to these different non-linguistic stimuli and tasks, which I try to group kind of by type here, and they span a wide range of abilities. So in yellow, we have responses to visual stimuli, both social and non-social. In orange are responses to auditory stimuli, including in lighter shades, responses to diverse kinds of rich and complex music. In red are responses to hand and face motor control, so exerting, controlling muscle movements in various effectors. Numerical cognition tests like solving math problems in pink. reading computer code in purple, executive function tasks, like your typical kind of Stroop or flanker tasks, working memory tasks, and things like that in blue. Categorization, so deciding whether an object belongs to a particular class, and visual event comprehension in green. So as you can see, these brain areas that work really hard when we process language work about as hard. Oh, and I should say that 0 here is, of course, your low-level baseline. So looking at a blank screen with no stimuli. So these regions that work really hard when you process language work about as hard as when you're solving a math problem or holding information in working memory or listening to music as they do when you're doing nothing at all, or whatever it is that you do when you're lying in the scanner without external stimulation. If we draw a line from the control condition, the reading of non-words or listening to non-word sequences, we can see that the only conditions that get above that baseline are visual meaningful events. So this is pictures of meaningful events. This response is still much lower, about twice lower than the response elicited by sentences. And as I'll tell you in a second, patients with severe language damage don't appear to have problems with interpreting such stimuli, suggesting that this response is not functionally critical. Nevertheless, I think it's interesting, and we're following up and trying to understand what exactly it reflects. And it's important to know that all of these conditions elicit highly robust responses in some other parts of the brain. So it's not that they're bad tasks or something. They just happen to activate parts of the brain that are separate, spatially distinct from the ones that support language processing. So a complementary approach for addressing the question of whether language shares machinery with other mental functions is to look at cognitive abilities of individuals who lack a properly functioning language system due to aphasia. And most informative are cases of so-called global aphasia. So global aphasia typically results from damage to the language system as a result of a large stroke in the middle cerebral artery, which is a big artery that supports your perisylvian, frontal, and temporal cortex. And here are just 3 sample patients' brains, and you can see how extensive this kind of damage is. These patients have incredibly profound deficits in both producing and understanding language. In the kind of good cases, they have some residual single word comprehension for high frequency concrete words, but that's about it. Rosemary Varley at UCL has been studying this population for many years now. And over the years, she and her colleagues have examined a wide range of abilities in these individuals, including some work we've done collaboratively. So this is asking, so the logic here is, right, you take a person without a proper language system is effectively gone, and you say, okay, can these patients still solve math problems, right? Can they still process structure and music and things like that? And it turns out that strikingly, in spite of these profound linguistic deficits, globally aphasic individuals have intact arithmetic, logic, and problem-solving abilities. They have perfectly fine executive control. They can process structure and music. They are socially and emotionally competent, and they have a rich understanding of how the world works. So the only thing these patients appear to lack is the ability to convert their thoughts into a verbal format or to extract meaningful information from others' linguistic productions. And of course, these findings align well with the kind of selectivity that I showed you that emerged from our fMRI work. These findings also align with self-reports of aphasic individuals that go back many centuries. And here's just one quote that I like. This is from a German philosopher, Johann Spalding, who became aphasic after a stroke. And he wrote, with effort, presumably, I saw and recognized everything around me in its true shape. I tried to speak to see if something coherent could be uttered, but no matter how much I forced attention and thoughts together, shapeless and entirely different words ensued rather than the ones I wanted. I therefore contented myself with the expectation that I would not be able to speak or write for the duration of my life, but that the principles and dispositions known to me would always remain the same. And there's quite a number of such powerful quotes that really highlight the separation between the ability of these individuals to think, to process the world in all the same ways that they could prior to their language damage, and the stark inability to use language to share these internal states with others. there are a couple important things to keep in mind here. They may seem obvious, and yet it keeps coming up in talks and reviewers' comments and things like that. So I just want to clarify them here. So one is that functional specialization does not entail innateness. Those are distinct constructs. We know that functional specificity can arise as a function of our experience in the world, with the prime example perhaps being a region in the visual cortex that specializes for processing letters in the script that's familiar to you, which is obviously not there before you learn to read. And the second is the fact that the fact that language draws on specialized machinery, which, like I said, presumably is the part of the brain where we store our language knowledge representations, does not mean that the computations that support language are fundamentally distinct from those that support information processing in other domains. In fact, I would bet a lot of money that many of the computations that have been invoked in other domains, from retrieving representations from memory to predictive processing to integrating elements into more complex representations, are the very same ones that support language processing. Importantly, though, we have ample evidence now that all these computations are implemented locally within the language network, rather than in some centralized hub that language and other domains would draw on. And presumably this is so because of computational and metabolic efficiency that is afforded by local implementation. And we summarize some of this evidence in a review that's coming out in Current Directions in Psych Science. And third, another point I want to make here is that so far we've talked about the separation between language and thought in adult, fully formed brains. But maybe language is critical for the development of thought. And that is indeed an argument that many have made. So here, of course, we have very little evidence because we can't intentionally deprive kids of language. But we have some hints from deaf kids born to hearing parents. So in fact, the majority of deaf kids are born to hearing parents. And of course, in such cases, the parents often will not have had a reason to learn sign language. In some places, especially where there is very little education about deafness and about sign languages, such kids have not been exposed to language up until a few years into their life, sometimes into their teenage years. Now, these kids are loved and they get all the same cognitive stimulation that kids exposed to language do. They're just not getting linguistic input because they're not getting, they're not seeing sign language, and they can't process auditory spoken language. And you can ask, do these kids who grow up without language in their early years, do they show some differences in their perception or cognition? And the answer appears to be, so the evidence here is quite scarce, and I think more work is needed. And it seems that strikingly, most reasoning abilities appear to develop just fine absent language. This is not to say that you couldn't get there faster with language. Of course, language is very useful for explaining certain things to someone, certain concepts, but it appears to not be a critical prerequisite. The only exception appears to be some aspects of theory of mind, or thinking about what somebody else is thinking, which does show some delays if you have delayed exposure to language. All right, so to restate, the language system does not appear to share resources with other abilities, any of the ones that we tested so far, which is a lot at this point. But I also want to say that there is a growing amount of evidence suggesting that in spite of this sharp separation between language and the rest of our cognitive arsenal, there is a strong connection between language and social cognition. And this evidence comes from a variety of sources. I'm going to actually skip a little bit here. And I'll just mention this evidence briefly, but happy again to talk about it more in the question period. So first, in spite of the different prominences of language and social cognition in the left versus right hemisphere respectively, the topographic patterns of the language and the system that has been linked to social cognition are broadly similar, especially in the temporal lobe. Just showing you here group level maps just to show you the coarse similarity. Remember again, within individual participants, these networks are fully dissociable. So here are data from some of, again, Rod Braga's work, showing that there are these nearby but distinct areas. But the fact that these two networks show this interdigitated pattern within broadly similar parts of the association cortex seems important. And Lauren Di Nicola, among others, and some similar ideas had emerged in our group in parallel, have suggested that perhaps in some such cases, there was a proto-network that later in development and or evolution split into multiple distinct networks. So I think this proximity of these areas is not to be ignored. And there's a bunch more kinds of evidence. So for example, even setting aside theory of mind, which is kind of like the most sophisticated aspects of social cognition, many other functions relevant to perceiving, understanding, and interacting with conspecifics activate areas on the lateral temporal surface. This is, includes things like face perception, to perceiving biological motion, recognizing voices, and so on. And these different functions have typically been studied by distinct subfields of cognitive science and neuroscience. And I think this fractionation across fields may have obscured some generalizations. And we're trying to start to bring it all together, try to understand how this socially responsive cortex may emerge and come to look the way that it does in the adult brain. Right. And one other thing I'll mention here is that in a recent study in macaques, and there's now been a similar study in bonobos, this is brain imaging work in non-human primates, showing that responses during the processing of socially relevant information elicit activity in brain regions that kind of eerily resemble the general topography of the language system in humans, so including these inferior frontal components and the lateral extent of the lateral temporal cortex. So perhaps evolutionarily, we started out with this broad swath of socially responsive cortex, which as we get more and more experience in development, or as we got more sophisticated socially over the course of evolution, fractionates into these distinct areas which now track different aspects of the socially relevant signal, from faces, eye gaze, to gestures, to body movements, to processing symbolic meaningful information like in human language. And I'm hoping that we can test this using developmental data in the next decade or so as methods for probing brains of kids around the age of 1 to 2 years old are advancing. There is a whole bunch of other lines of evidence from both brain imaging work, from work in development, from characterizing linguistic exchanges. And I'm just putting them out here without talking about them in detail. But there's basically a bunch of hints from all sorts of directions suggesting that language and social perception cognition appear to be very deeply linked, and I would argue much more so than language and complex reasoning abilities, which show dissociations time and again across various methodologies, including data I've showed you, but also in developmental disorders. Okay. So now shifting gears to look a little more deeply within the language system to see if some of the properties of linguistic representations and computations may maybe give us some hints about the function of language. And I'm going to argue that language, on the one hand, has properties that make it well suited for communication, and on the other hand, has properties that actually make it not suitable for complex thought. So there are at least two features that I would say make it likely that communication is its primary function. First is that natural languages are highly efficient for information transfer. There is now abundant evidence suggesting that natural languages have been strongly shaped by communicative pressures at all levels, from the sound systems to the lexica to even grammars, altogether leading to a linguistic code that is short on average, which makes it easy to produce, easy to say or sign. And on the other hand, contextually disambiguated and very strongly redundant, which makes it easy to understand and robust to noise, which often characterizes linguistic exchanges. And if language evolved for internal thought, it is unclear why it would exhibit such characteristics. A lot of this work is summarized in a paper from a couple of years ago from Ted Gibson, Roger Levy, and others. And second, is that language processing appears to rely on predictive coding. And there's now evidence for the importance of prediction in language from many groups, many modalities, many fundamentally different approaches. And I'll talk about some of this in a second. But prediction prediction in language, at least to me, really only makes sense from the perspective of a comprehender in the context of linguistic exchange. So engaging in predictive processing makes comprehension easier by basically reducing the effort because expected elements are now pre-activated and you don't have to work as hard when you receive them. And I just can't develop a coherent story for why language processing would become predictive if language was primarily an internal system of thought. But very happy to hear your ideas if you have some. So in terms of evidence for predictive processing in language, there is many behavioral and brain imaging investigations showing that comprehenders engage in prediction. But I want to talk to you about a relatively recent source of evidence, and I think a very powerful one, which comes from artificial neural network language models. So just to step back, there have historically been two main barriers to probing language mechanisms. One is, of course, that animal models have limited utility. There are some aspects of perception and motor control that you can study with animal models, but to understand the full complexity of human language, it's hard using the kind of communication systems that exist in other species. And the second problem is that until recently, we've lacked adequate computationally explicit accounts of how meaning can be extracted from language. We simply didn't have algorithms that could perform the task of meaning approximation or extraction on the full spectrum of natural linguistic inputs. I give you a sentence and you give me a representation of the meaning. But just a few years ago, the second barrier has effectively been lifted, where increases in computing power, availability of massive corpora, linguistic corpora, and machine learning advances have led to real breakthroughs in many areas of artificial intelligence, including critically language, so that some artificial neural network models, most notably so-called transformer architectures, suddenly could do really impressive things, from answering questions to generating free-form text to translating between languages and so on. And the fact that these very successful models are trained on general word prediction tasks suggests that this form of training leads to very flexible and robust representations. And this is presumably because in order to successfully predict the next word, you basically have to build a joint probability model of the signal. So you have to, it basically implicitly requires the model to pay attention to diverse kinds of regularities, from the syntactic structure to word collocations to world knowledge and plausibility that's reflected in some of the linguistic statistics. And perhaps this is what humans are doing too, as they're acquiring linguistic competence and processing language in a mature system. Right, so I said that, but in recent work, we and a few other groups now have tried to take it one step further and actually explicitly tried to link the representations extracted from these artificial neural network language models to representations extracted from the human brain. This effort was led by Martin Schrimpf, a graduate student in our department, along with a few others. And the approach he adopted comes from vision research, where it's proven incredibly successful. And he calls it, and Jim DiCarlo's group has introduced this term of integrative benchmarking. So the essence here is that in order to link some computation and some brain function, it's not enough to test a single model on a single data set. Because these models are oversimplistic, they're almost certainly all wrong and not exactly how our brain solves problems, but some models may be more useful than others. And examining the variability across models and trying to understand why some models perform better at capturing neural responses than others can be very powerfully informative. And so here we're trying to look for consistent patterns of performance across many different kinds of models applied to multiple data sets, together with their performance on the proposed core computational function of the system in question. In this case, it's going to be prediction, the prediction of upcoming words. So we examined 43 language models against 3 neural data sets from humans. And the approach is really quite straightforward. So you have these data from humans where they process certain sentences, and we have their neural responses. And then we feed the same materials to the models and capture their internal state, so unit activations in some layer, generally a layer pretty, it depends on how you visualize your model, close to the output layer. And then you use some portion of the human neural data and you train a regression from the model unit activations to brain responses. And then you see how well this model generalizes to predicting responses in unseen human neural data. And first, we just asked, well, how well do these models even perform on our data sets? And here I'm plotting normalized productivity. So each bar here is a different model. So these are our 43 language models. And the ceiling one here is based on the internal reliability of the data set. So how well you can predict one human's neural responses to language from another human's neural responses to language. So this is kind of setting a limit of how well you can predict those responses with some external model, like an ANN language model. And things to note here are that models vary quite a bit in how well they do. And that some models in this class of unidirectional attention transform architectures like GPT already kind of hit this estimated ceiling in these data. The raw ceiling, I should say, is about 0.25 to 0.3. It varies a little bit across data sets. This is substantially lower than what you get in, say, monkey physiology data in vision, where it goes, up to like 0.9. And we're working on ways to try to increase the signal, the raw ceiling in human language data. But this is about as good as you can get. So these are very high quality data. And so this is about the best we can hope to do at this point. Okay, and so then next and critically, we asked, is it the case that models that perform best on this next word prediction test, what comes next, also the ones that provide the best fit to human neural data? And so now I'm going to show you a scatter plot where now each dot is a model. And on the x-axis, I'm showing you next word prediction performance. And this is perplexity. So smaller values are better performance. And on the y-axis is, again, this normalized productivity, or what we sometimes call brain scores, how well you score on predicting brain performance. And indeed, you find a strong relationship so that the same models that do better at next word prediction also predict neural responses best. You may wonder, well, is it just the case that models that do better on next word prediction are just bigger models? They have more parameters to fit. And no, that doesn't explain this, because if you take a random embedding of the same dimensionality, as some of these better performing models, they do very poorly at explaining human neural data. So then we thought, well, maybe it's performance on any language task that will predict how well you capture human neural responses. And to ask this question, we looked at a host of tasks from natural language processing known as the GLUE benchmark set. And these include pretty sophisticated tasks like grammaticality judgments, judging similarity of meanings of two sentences, and so on. And here we find no relationship with neural productivity, either considering these tasks altogether, so this is average performance across these different GLUE tasks, or considering them individually. So the gray bars are these individual GLUE tasks, and the only task that modulates the model's ability to predict human neural data is the next word prediction task. And this selective relationship between performance on next word prediction and neural productivity suggests that maybe optimizing for predictive representations is a critical objective for both biological and artificial networks for language. Okay, so those were two properties that make language, I think, good as a communication system. It has all sorts of properties of the sound system, lexicons, and grammar that make it efficient for information transfer. And there is strong evidence for language relying on predictive processing. So now I briefly want to mention two properties that I think make it not well suited for, or even incompatible with, supporting complex thought. So first, complex thought usually involves relating different propositions to one another. So it naturally requires integrating information over extended temporal contexts. Yet the language system appears to have a relatively short temporal receptive window. This notion of temporal receptive windows has been growing in popularity. It's actually quite an old notion, but it's been becoming more popular, in part due to work by Uri Hasson at Princeton. And it's basically a temporal analog of spatial receptive fields in the visual cortex, where the size of the spatial field increases as you move from the primary visual areas to the higher order ones. So the temporal receptive window of a cell or a brain area tells you how much of the preceding context affects the processing of the current stimulus. And we've long known that the language network is not sensitive to structure at the discourse level. So for example, in very sharp contrast to its robust sensitivity to structure at the phrase and sentence level, where the responses to, say, a sentence are twice or three times higher than the response to just a list of unconnected words. The response to a connected discourse, a set of sentences that make a little story or something like that, is the same as to a set of totally unconnected, unrelated sentences, suggesting that this system is not computing relationships between clauses. So this is a finding from back in the mid-90s, and we've replicated it in several different approaches as well. And several lines of recent evidence, so this is all work that's still ongoing, suggest that the integration window of the language system is actually only around 6 to 8 words. It may seem kind of striking, it should, it did to me for a long time, but if we take seriously the idea that the cognitive architecture we have is adapted to the kind of input we get, this short window actually fits very well with the finding that across the typologically diverse languages, most dependencies between words are actually local. So even though there's been millions of NIH dollars spent studying sentences that have a lot of intermediate material, intervening material between, say, a subject and a verb, if you look at the actual properties of natural productions, you'll find that over 90% of dependencies are between adjacent words or one word apart, and only occasionally you have these non-local connections. And so there is now a bunch of questions of why this exact, I should also say that words is probably not the right unit. It's most likely bits. In fact, word is a very kind of Anglo-centric notion, but I'm just using this kind of as an operationalization for now. It's just easy to think about, but it's most likely bits. So it's likely going to be a little bit variable across languages depending on how information is packaged into words. But the question is now why this particular span? And there's a few different hypotheses that we're exploring, from things like this is about the amount of linguistic material that corresponds to clauses, which are capable of conveying information about events. So events are very useful units of our experience, and you need a clause to describe an event level representation. To the fact that in speech production, this length corresponds roughly to what's known as prosodic units. So we talk in continuous chunks of speech, but we take pauses occasionally, some of us less than others, but we do pause, and the length of these continuous chunks of speech appear to correspond to about this length of text. And there's a few other ideas, and we're trying to explore them as well as test the length of this receptive window across typologically different languages. Now, of course, we have mechanisms now in brains that keep track of information over longer scales. So a system I briefly mentioned is the theory of mind system here. Right next to it is a system known as the default network system that many of you know, and Lauren did a lot of beautiful work showing both the separation of the system from the nearby theory of mind system and characterizing it for some of its key properties. And this is a network that's linked to a bunch of cognitive processes, including episodic projection of yourself into the past and into the future. And this is likely the system that constructs what some refer to as situation models. So building up an event level representation where there's agents, relationships among them, and so on. And of course, these kinds of models are built regardless of whether we're processing a linguistic narrative, or if we're watching a silent film, or just observing some people interacting. And I think this system is likely one downstream target of the language system. So we get linguistic input, we crunch it through the language processing mechanism to get some approximations of these meanings in these relatively small chunks, and then these representations are turned into some kind of more abstract format, I would say, is likely, and then set down to the system like the default network, which actually performs downstream inference and whatever else you might want to do with information that you get from language, like making social inference, which perhaps happens in the theory of mind system, reasoning about the world, and so on and so forth, predicting what's going to happen next, and so on. Okay. And now I briefly want to make one argument specifically against the Chomskyan construal of language, since I started with Chomsky's quote early on. So I'm actually going to skip. I'll put it up, but don't worry about the details of this diagram. I'll just briefly say the key bit. So in the Chomskyan construal of language, the focus has long been on syntactic structure, syntactic rules and representations. And since about the mid-90s, this whole syntactic machinery has been reduced to a single operation that they refer to as merge, which is basically an operation that allows you to take two elements and combine them into a complex representation, right? Join them together. Now, the reasoning that has been put forward is that this operation emerged in humans, and this is what enabled greater complexity in this, what they call internal conceptual repertoire, which is basically thought, right? Enabling more complex thoughts. Now, critically, for this kind of argument to work, this operation, this merge operation, has to be highly abstract, in that it shouldn't really care much about the nature of the elements that are being combined. But the abstractness of syntax in natural language has long been questioned in linguistics, psycholinguistics, language development, neuroscience, computational linguistics, and pretty much any field of language research. It turns out that language really doesn't appear to rely on abstract syntax. So just to give you a sense, like the critical bit of evidence against the abstractness of syntax is that there haven't been any unit found so far, be it a whole network, a brain region, a voxel or a cluster of voxels, a population of cells that we can probe with intracranial recordings, that would show sensitivity to structure in language. For example, responding more to structured than unstructured input, or showing sensitivity to structural complexity that does not also show sensitivity to word meanings. For example, responding more to table than blicket. Now, given that sensitivity to word meanings, it's just not clear to me how those units could be implementing merge. Now you can make some excuses and say maybe every time you get a real word, you try to build a structure around it, but then the story becomes unfalsifiable and therefore I think uninteresting. And in line with this general lack of abstractness of linguistic syntax, arguments are accumulating and evidence against the general distinction between memory and computation in the brain. And here's a couple of reviews that I recommend to those of you interested in these questions. But basically, evidence comes from, for example, neurobiology, where even simple organisms where we understand them in terms of what each particular cell is doing, there's no evidence of some cells just storing information and other cells doing computations. The very same cells that store information also perform computations. And arguments also come from what we've learned about computational efficiency, in that memory allows for reuse of past computations through memorization. So basically, instead of computing things every time you get some input and you have to perform some transformation on it, you store function calls as a set of procedural steps that you can apply again when you see the same input in the future. And of course, recent machine learning algorithms use function approximation architectures to basically kind of adapt in an adaptive way, figure out at what level of granularity and detail it's useful to store these sets of function calls. So going back to the question I posed at the beginning of the talk, what is the primary function of language? Is it to think more complex thoughts or to share thoughts with others? I've shown you that the language system doesn't appear to support non-linguistic cognitive abilities, but I've alluded to this body of work suggesting that there is strong links between the system that supports language processing and the one that supports, or the ones that support social perception and cognition. And that properties of language suggest that it may be optimized for efficient communication, and some other properties make it not suitable for complex thought, meaning that if it only tracks information in these very short contexts, and the combinatorial machinery that supports word combinations in language is not abstract, but is actually tied to very particular lexical items, then it's just unclear how that kind of machinery could have given rise to abstract thought and reasoning, more complex abstract thought and reasoning. So I would say both of these lines of evidence support this notion that language is more likely to have come about to share thoughts with conspecifics. And I think I'm going to stop here, but we can talk about some future directions if you guys want. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fedorenko. And we have a number of questions in the Q&A box. So we will be going a bit past 1 p.m. just for those of you who are planning to join us in the additional Q&A. We'll let you know when we move to that link. For now, let's get to a few questions before we do that, if that's okay with you. Okay, so I'm going to go in the order of the upvoted questions, and we'll get through a few before we switch. So first, a question says, the claim that language is separate from thought assumes thought as a singular entity. Isn't it possible there are different systems of thought with independent machinery and that language is one such system. This would be inconsistent with fMRI, with your fMRI experiments.
It says consistent there, but yeah, so
consistent. My bad.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No. So
important.
So it's absolutely true that thought is a host of abilities, and what people constitute as thought varies across definitions. I think there's at least two or three particular high-level systems that I think likely participate in thought, but irrespective of whether thought is a singular thing or distinct things, what I'm arguing is that the language system is not a system for thought. You can take language away and none of the thought capacities appear to be affected, suggesting that even though we can use language to talk about our thoughts and we can get very complex information from language, this is not the system that performs the actual reasoning and builds connections across abstract representations.
Thank you. Okay, let's keep going with some questions. So next we have a question that says, great talk, thank you so much. You've implied that because loss of language doesn't result in loss of complex thought, we can disregard the theory that language is primarily in support of complex thought. However, since loss of language doesn't result in loss of communicative functions that you have shown overlap with the language network, can we not use the same logic there?
So this is important to clarify. So communicative functions, you mean like social, perceptual, and cognitive functions, I presume? So those do not overlap with language either. So in fact, I didn't have time to spend quite as much time as I had hoped, but language is separate from both the kinds of abilities that are linked to complex thought and reasoning, problem solving, and so on, and from social, perceptual, and cognitive functions. And what I'm saying is that in spite of the fact that it's separate from both, there are stronger connections between the areas that support language processing and the mechanisms, I should say, that support language processing, and the mechanisms that support some of these social, perceptual, and cognitive functions. And the reasons for that, claim, the evidence for that claim comes in the form of some neural evidence, like spatial proximity of these systems to each other, and the fact that the language and the theory of mind systems show some above baseline synchronization, even though they're perfectly segregable, as well as a host of behavioral evidence from things like, to learn a language, you have to develop basic social capacities like joint attention, to the fact that without early language exposure, you seem to show delays in theory of mind, some aspects of theory of mind reasoning. So there's a whole bunch of these very strongly suggest, to the fact that most of the use of language is about other people. So to the extent people have tried to quantify contents of linguistic exchanges, it's mostly gossip, which is, in line with us being social species and being interested in other people. So there's a whole pile of threads of very different kinds of evidence suggesting stronger links between language and social functions compared to language and reasoning, general kind of reasoning about the world or problem solving, in spite of the fact that it's separated from both. So I hope that clarified.
Thank you so much. We'll move to the next question. Okay, so this question says, I suppose you could maybe argue that language is predictive because the cortex functions in a predictive manner more generally. In other words, the predictive nature of language may not necessarily relate to anything unique about language. I like your explanation that language is predictive in the service of communication better, but in the interest of entertaining criticism, it might be one possibility worth consideration. And then this person arrived late, so wanted to mention that. Okay.
Yeah, that's I absolutely agree with this. That's absolutely right. So prediction is emerging as one candidate of a canonical computation. So maybe that's what the whole brain is doing. And in that case, then it just doesn't really become kind of an argument one way or another. It's not contradictory to what I said, but maybe it's not specifically applied to language, most likely not specifically applied to language. I agree with that. So yeah, that's something to potentially grapple with, but yeah, thank you for that.
Awesome. Okay, maybe we'll have time for just a few more, and we'll put a deadline of 1:10 that we switch to the other link. Okay. All right, so the next question now says, thanks for the wonderful talk. I was wondering if it is possible that the high correlation between brain data and next word prediction model performance is coming from the fact that single word embeddings are critically important for the models used in the analysis. Is the unit of meaning at the word level responsible for the uniqueness of the next word prediction task?
I'm not sure I'm quite getting this. I mean, so there is certainly a word embedding layer in all of these models. But once you move beyond that level, it represents more complex things than just single words. Let me see if I can, if this person wants to come online and clarify, I'm just not, is the unit of meaning at the word level responsible?
Siki, would you like to clarify in the chat?
I'm not quite.
We can give you a moment to do so if you'd like, and I can ask the next question. Does that sound okay? Okay. All right, let's see. The next question mentions, okay, awesome. The Siki will bring this question to the next Q&A. Perfect, thank you. Okay, so another question for right now in our remaining time. This refers to a recent paper in Science that showed us that syntactic properties of language light up the same brain regions as tool use. So this person wanted to bring this paper to your attention regarding your hypothesis that language doesn't share brain regions with most other cognitive abilities. So wondering if you'd like to address those ideas.
Yeah, there's a lot of papers out there that have claimed overlap with between language and other things. And yeah, and I'm aware of this paper as well. So here are the things that you want to look out for in evaluating some of these papers. So this paper, like many others, use a complexity contrast between syntactically harder and syntactically easier sentences to identify the bits of the language, what they call the language bits. And then they use a complexity contrast in another task. And then they find that those overlap. Now, we know that there is a set of regions in our brain, both cortical and subcortical, that are very deeply sensitive to effort in a very domain general manner, meaning when your brain has to work harder, those regions come online. I suspect from a brief reading of this paper that the overlap that is being observed happens within this domain general system. I call the system the multiple demand system. Other people use different names like the cognitive control system, but yeah, I can definitely find overlap between a complexity manipulation in language and a complexity manipulation in another domain, because they will both elicit responses in the system. And I think those are just, so that system is quite distinct from the system that actually interprets linguistic output and interprets linguistic input and generates linguistic output. It's a system it's a very important system. It's linked to fluid intelligence and supports all sorts of stuff. But we and a few others now have shown that it only comes online during language when you either use highly artificial materials or supplement basic language processing with some task on top of it, like if you have to make some inference with the information that you received as part of your linguistic test. So that's my take on that.
Thank you so much. Okay, with that, it's 1:10 p.m. right now, so we're going to switch to the other Q&A link. Thank you so much again for this amazing talk. I've just put the link in the chat. If anyone would like to switch to the other link to join us to continue the discussion. Okay, see you there.
Thanks, everyone.